1. Okay. Three, two, one. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Before we get started, as always, I want to give a lovely shout out to the music we've been listening to during the pre-stream here. This is Dreamer by Deuscain DP. You can find the information in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. Thank you to Deuscain and everybody like them who makes either free to use or low-cost assets so we can have better streams. Thank you very much. But yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever it is in your part of the world. I am Deuscain, your variety type streamer for the night in my part of the world. And tonight we are having a very special occasion. I am doing what I am referring to as ASMR Storytime on Sunday, or Storytime Sunday, to ring in the spooky season. We are officially halfway through September, and it is not a defense against God and Christendom to start doing Halloween stuff. Some people get started a little early for my tastes, but I have put out my streaming schedule earlier today. We got a bunch of new games on the list that are spooky and in the theme of the season. Plus, surprisingly, Sea of Stars works pretty well for that too. But today, we're going to be doing some ASMR style readings of some good old-fashioned horror stories, and I'm gonna see how well I can do this, because I haven't really done this much before. But before we jump into that, I do want to give a thanks to Hex02 for their follow yesterday after... What's that? That would have been after our Sea of Stars stream. So, Hex, thank you very much for the follow. I greatly appreciate it. But let me get switched over to our chatting screen. Before I do that, I do want to let everybody know I do have alerts turned off completely during this because I don't want something coming in and blaring while we're doing anything. And because of that, I also I have some alerts and stuff on the screen, but sound alerts are turned off even though they're in the bottom. The alerts for gifts and stuff are I'm going to be turning off the donations for Coffee and Throne. In fact, I'm going to do it now while I'm talking about it so I can think about it while I'm doing it. And then the other stuff's just absolutely just not there. So. But yeah, so, much as I do appreciate the support, whatever method you use, alerts aren't going to work. Not today. Also, because it is the spooky season and in the spirit of the season, I decided to make some small changes to my model. I don't know how often I'll use it after tonight, but I did fiddle around with a few things, and yeah, I'll show you that in just a sec. So, without further ado, let's get switched over to the chatting screen. Welcome, chat. It is a dark and rainy night. Not very stormy, but it is raining. And I've got a nice fire going for us here. Maybe you can hear it snapping, crackling, and popping while I talk to you. I hope it's not too much distraction. What's that? I'm wearing an interesting outfit tonight. It's the rain, you see. I was feeling a little cold, even with the fire. Oh, what's that? It's not just the outfit. I'm a little pale. Guess I must be chillier from the rain than I realized. Anyway, let's not dilly-dally for too long. No, it's not just the lack of color. It's the teeth. Well, I'll have you know my dentist speaks very highly of how I take care of my teeth. Thank you very much. And I don't need you sassing me. I work hard enough for these teeth. So we're going to start here with a couple of what I found as public domain horror stories. Hopefully I won't get into too much trouble sharing them with you, but on this dark and rainy night, might be a little bit fun to share something a little spooky, if you get what I'm saying. The first story is called The Leaden Ring by Sabine Baring-Gould. And as a warning in advance, I haven't proofread all of these before using them, so some of these might get very interesting depending on the content in them. But The Leaden Ring by Sabine Baring-Gould. It's not possible, Julia. I cannot conceive how the idea of attending the country ball can have entered your head after what has happened. Poor young Hattersley's dreadful death suffices to stop that. But Aunt, Mr. Hattersley is no relation of ours. No relation, but you know that poor fellow would not have shot himself if that had not been for you. Oh, Aunt Elizabeth, how can you say so when the verdict was that he committed suicide when in an unsound condition of mind? How could I help his blowing out his brains when those brains were deranged? Julia, do not talk like this. If he did go off his head, it was you who upset him by first drawing on him, leading him to believe that you liked him, and then throwing him over so soon as the Han. James Lowler appeared on the tapis. Consider, what will people say if you go to the assembly? What will they say if I do not go? They will immediately set it down to my caring deeply for James Hattersley, and they will think there was some sort of engagement. They are not likely to suppose that. But really, Julia, you were for a while all smiles and encouragement. Tell me, now, did Mr. Hattersley propose to you? Well, yes, he did, and I refused him. And then he went and shot himself in despair. Julia, you cannot with any face go to the ball. Nobody knows he's proposed, and precisely because I do go, everyone will conclude that he did not propose. I do not wish it to be supposed that he did. His family, of course, must be aware. They will see your name among those present at the assembly. And they are in too great trouble to look at the paper to see who went to the dance. His terrible death lies at your door. How can you have the heart, Julia? I don't see it. Of course I feel it. I'm awfully sorry. I'm awfully sorry for his father, the Admiral. I cannot set him up again. I wish that when I rejected him he had gone and done as did Joe Pomeroy, and marry one of his landlady's daughters. There, Julia, is another one of your delinquencies. You lured on young Pomeroy till he proposed, then you refused him, and in a fit of vexation and mortified vanity he married a girl greatly beneath him in social position. If the menagerie prove a failure, you will have it on your conscience. You have wrecked his life and perhaps hers as well. I cannot throw myself away as charity to save this man or that from doing a foolish thing. What I complain of, Julia, is that you encouraged young Mr. Pomeroy till Mr. Hattersley appeared, whom you thought more eligible, and then you tossed him aside. And you did precisely the same with James Hattersley as soon as you came to know Mr. Lowler. After all, Julia, I am not sure that Mr. Pomeroy has not chosen the better part. The girl, I dare say, is simple, fresh, and affectionate. Your implication is not complimentary, Aunt Elizabeth. My dear, I have no patience for the young lady of the present day, who is shallow, self-willed, and indifferent to the feelings and happiness of others, who craves for excitement and pleasure, and desires nothing that is useful and good. Where now will you see a girl like Viola's sister, who let concealment, like a worm in the bud, feed on her damask cheek? Nowadays a girl lays herself at the feet of a man she likes, if she likes him, turns herself inside out to let him and all the world read her heart. I have no relish to be like Viola's sister, and have my story a blank. Never groveled at the feet of Joe Pomeroy or James Hattersley. No, but you led each to consider himself the favored one till he proposed, and then you refused him. It's like smiling at a man and then stabbing him in the heart. Well, I don't want people to think that James Hattersley cared for me. I certainly never cared for him, nor that he proposed, so I shall go to the ball. Julia Demant was an orphan. She had been retained at school until she was 18 and had been removed just at the age when a girl begins to take an interest in her studies, and not to regard them as drudgery. On her removal, she cast away all that she had acquired, and had been plunged into the whirl of society. Suddenly her father died. She had lost her mother some years before, and she went to live with her aunt, Miss Fleming. Julia had inherited a sum of about £500 a year, and would probably come in for a good estate and funds as well in the death of her aunt. She had been flattered as a girl at home, and at school as a beauty, and she certainly thought no small bones of herself. Miss Fleming was an elderly lady with a sharp tongue, very outspoken and very decided on her opinions. But her opinion was weak, and Julia soon discovered that she could bend the aunt to do anything she willed, although she could not modify or alter her opinions. In the matter of Joe Pomeroy and James Hattersley, it was as Miss Fleming said. Julia had encouraged Mr. Pomeroy and had only cast him off because she thought better of the suit of Mr. Hattersley, son of an admiral of that name. She had seen a good deal of young Hattersley, had given him every encouragement, had so entangled him that he was madly in love with her, and then when she came to know of the Hon, James Lawler, and saw that he was fascinated, she rejected Hattersley, with the consequences alluded to in the previous conversation. Julia was particularly anxious to be present at the country ball, for she had been already booked by Mr. Lawler for several dances, and she was quite resolved to make an attempt to bring him to a declaration. On the evening of the ball, Miss Fleming and Julia entered the carriage. The aunt had given way, as was her wont, but under protest. For about 10 minutes neither spoke, and then Miss Fleming said, "Well, you know my feelings about this dance. I do not approve. I distinctly disapprove. I do not consider your going to the ball in good taste, or as you would put it, in good form. Poor young Hattersley. Oh, dear aunt, do let us put young Hattersley aside. He was buried with the regular forms, I suppose." "Yes, Julia." "Then the rector accepted the verdict at the jury at the inquest. Why should not we? A man who is unsound in his mind is not responsible for his actions." "I suppose not." "Much less than I, who live 10 miles away." "I do not say that you are responsible for his death, but for the condition of mind that led him to the dreadful deed. Really, Julia, you are one of those into whose head or heart only by surgical operation could the thought be introduced that you could be in the wrong. A hypodermic syringe would be too weak an instrument to effect such a radical change in you. Everyone else may be in the wrong, you never. As for me, I cannot get young Hattersley out of my mind." "And I," retorted Julia with asperity, for her aunt's words had stung her, "I, for my part, do not give him a thought." She had hardly spoken the words before a chill wind began to pass round her. She drew the barrage shawl that was over her bare shoulders closer around her, and said, "Auntie, is the glass down on your side?" "No, Julia, why do you ask?" "There is such a draught." "A draught? I do not feel one. Perhaps the wind on your side hitches." "Indeed, that is all right. It is blowing harder and is deadly cold. Can one of the front panes be broken?" "No, Rogers would have told me if that had been the case. Besides, I can see that they are sound." The wind of which Julia complained swirled and whistled around her, increased in force, plucked at her shawl, and slew it about her throat. It tore at the lace on her dress. It snatched at her hair. It wrenched it away from the pins, the combs that held it in place. One long stretch was lashed across the face of Miss Fleming. Then the hair, completely released, eddied up above the girl's head. The next moment was carried as a drift before her, blinding her. Then a sudden explosion, as though a gun had been fired into her ear, and with a scream of terror she sank back among the cushions. Miss Fleming, in great alarm, pulled the check string, and the carriage stopped. The footman descended from the box and came to the side. The old lady drew down the window and said, "Oh, Philip, bring the lamp. Something has happened to Miss Dement." The man obeyed and sent a flood of light into the carriage. Julia was lying back, white and senseless. Her hair was scattered over her face, neck, and shoulders. The flower that had been stuck in it, the pins that had fastened it in place, the pads that had given the shape to the convolutions, lay strewn, some on her lap, some in the rug at the bottom of the carriage. Phillips, ordered the old lady with great agitation. Tell Rogers to turn the horses and drive home at once. Or do you run as fast as you can for Dr. Crate? A few minutes later, the carriage was again in motion. Julia revived. Her aunt was chafing her hand. "Oh, Aunt," she said, "are the glasses broken?" "Broken? What glasses?" "Those of the carriage, with the explosion." "Explosion, my dear?" "Yes, the gun which was discharged. It stunned me. Were you hurt?" "I heard no gun, no explosion." "But I did. It was as though a bullet had been dislodged in my brain. I wonder that I escaped. Who can have fired at us?" "My dear, no one fired. I heard nothing." "I know what it was. I had the same experience many years ago. I slept in a damp bed and awoke stone deaf in my right ear. I remained so for 3 weeks. One night when I was at a ball and was dancing, all at once I heard a report as of a pistol in my right ear, and immediately heard quite clearly again. It was wax. Aunt Elizabeth, I have not been deaf." You have not noticed that you were deaf." "Oh, but look at my hair. It was the wind that blew it about." "You are laboring under a delusion, Julia. There was no wind." "Look, feel how my hair was down." "That has been done by the motion of the carriage. There are many ruts in the road." They reached home, and Julia, feeling sick, frightened, and bewildered, retired to bed. Dr. Crate arrived, saying that she was hysterical, and ordered something to soothe her nerves. Julia was not convinced. The explanation offered by Miss Fleming did not satisfy her. That she was the victim to hysteria she did not in the least believe. Neither her aunt, nor the coachman, nor Phillips had heard the discharge of a gun. As to the rushing wind, Julia was satisfied that she had experienced it. The lace was ripped, as by a hand, from her dress, and the shawl was twisted around her throat. Besides, her hair had been so slightly arranged that the jolting of the carriage... Her hair had not been so slightly arranged that the jolting of the carriage would completely disarrange it. She was vastly perplexed over what she had undergone. She thought and thought, but could get no closer to the solution of the mystery. Next day, as she was almost herself again, she rose and went about as usual. In the afternoon, the Hon, James Lawler, called and asked after Miss Fleming. The butler replied that his mistress was out making calls, but that Miss Demant was at home, and he believed in the terrace. Miss Lawler at once asked to see her. He did not find Julia in the parlor or on the terrace, but in the lower garden, to which she had descended to feed the goldfish in the pond. "Oh, Miss Demant," he said, "I was so disappointed not to see you at the ball last night." "I was very unwell. I had a fainting fit and could not go." "It threw a damp on our spirits, that is to say, on mine. I had you booked for several dances. You were able to give them to others." "That was not the same to me. I did an act of charity and self-denial. I danced instead with the ugly Miss Bergens and with Miss Pounding, and that was like dragging about a sack of potatoes. I believed it would have been a jolly evening, but for the shocking affair of young Hattersley, which kept some of the better sort away. I mean, those who knew the Hattersleys. Know the Hattersleys. Of course, for me that did not matter. We were not acquainted. I'd never spoken with the fellow. You knew him, I believe. I heard some people say so, and that you had not come because of him. The supper, for a subscription ball, was not atrociously bad." "What did they say of me?" "Oh, if you will know, that you did not attend the ball because you liked him very much, and were awfully cut up." What a shame that people should talk. I never cared a rush for him. He was nice enough in his way, not a bounder, but tolerable as young men go." Mr. Lowther laughed. "I should not relish to have such a estimate made of me." "No need. Nor need you. You are interesting. He became so only when he had shot himself. It will be by this alone that he will be remembered." "But there is no smoke without fire. Did he like you much?" "Dear Mr. Lowther, I am not a clairvoyant. I was never able to see into the brains or hearts of people, least of all young men. Perhaps it is fortunate for me that I cannot. One lady told me he had proposed to you." Who was that? The potato sack? I will not give her name. Is there any truth in it? Did he? No. At the moment she spoke, there sounded in her ear a whistle of wind, and she felt a current like a cord of ice creep round her throat, increasing in force and compression. Her hat was blown off, and the next instant a detonation rang through her head as though a gun had been fired in her ear. She uttered a cry and sank upon the floor. James Lowler was bewildered. His first impulse was to run to the house for assistance, and then he considered he could not leave her lying on wet soil, and he stopped to raise her in her arms and carry her within. In novels, young men perform such a feat without difficulty, but in fact they are not able to do so, especially when the girl is tall and big-boned. Moreover, one in a faint is dead weight. Lowler staggered under his burden to the steps. It was as much as he could perform to carry her up to the terrace, where he placed her on a seat. Panting, with his muscles quivering after the strain, he hastened to the drawing room, rang the bell, and when the butler appeared, he gasped, "Miss Dement has fainted. You and I and the footman must carry her within." "She fainted last night in the carriage," said the butler. When Julia came to her senses, she was in bed, attended by the housekeeper and her maid. A few moments later, Miss Fleming arrived. "Oh, Auntie, I have heard it again." "Heard what, dear?" "The discharge of a gun." "It is nothing but wax," said the old lady. "I will drop a little sweet oil in your ear, and then have it syringed with warm water." "I want to tell you something, in private." Miss Fleming signed to the servants to withdraw. "Aunt," said the girl, "I must say something. This is the second time that this has happened. I am sure it is significant. James Lawler was with me in the sunken garden, and he began to speak about James Hattersley. I know it was when we were talking about him last night that I heard that awful noise. It was precisely as if a gun had been discharged into my ear. I felt as if all the nerves and tissues of my head were being torn, all the bones of my skull shattered. Just what Mr. Hattersley must have undergone when he pulled the trigger. It was agony for a moment, perhaps, but it felt as if it lasted an hour. Mr. Lowler asked me point blank if James Hattersley had proposed to me, and I said no. I was perfectly justified in so answering, because he had no right to ask me such a question. It was an impertinence on his part, and I answered him shortly and sharply with a negative. But actually, James Hattersley proposed twice to me. He would not accept a first refusal, but came next day bothering me again, and I was pretty curt with him. He made some remarks that were rude about how I had treated him, and which I will not repeat. As he left, in a state of great agitation, he said, "Julia, I vow you shall not forget this, and you shall belong to no one but me, alive or dead." I considered this great nonsense, and did not accord it with another thought. But really, these terrible annoyances, the wind and the bursts of noise, do seem to me to come from him. It is just as though he felt a malignant delight in distressing me now that he is dead. I should like to defy him, and I will do it if I can, but I cannot bear more of these experiences. They will kill me. Several days elapsed. Mr. Lowler called repeatedly to inquire, but a week passed before Julia was sufficiently recovered to receive him, and then the visit was one of courtesy and sympathy, and the conversation turned upon her health and on indifferent themes. Some days later it was otherwise. She was in the conservatory alone, pretty much herself again, when Mr. Lowler was announced. Physically she had recovered, or believed that she had, but her nerves had actually received a severe shock. She had made up her mind that the phenomenon of the cycling wind and the explosion were in some mysterious manner connected with Hattersley. She bitterly resented this, but was in mortal terror of recurrence, and she felt no compunction for her treatment of the unfortunate young man, but rather a deep sense of resentment against him. If he were dead, why did he not lie quiet and cease from vexing her? To be a martyr was to her no gratification, for hers was not a martyrdom that provoked sympathy, and which could make her interesting. She hitherto supposed that when a man died there was an end of him. This condition was determined for good or for ill. But that a disembodied spirit could hover about and make itself a nuisance to the living, had never entered into her calculations. "Julia, if I may be allowed so to call you," began Mr. Lowler, "I have brought you a bouquet of flowers. Will you accept them?" "Oh," she said, as he handed a bunch to her. "How kind of you. At this time of year they are so rare. An aunt's gardener is so miserly that he will spare me none from my room, but some miserable bits of geranium. It is too bad of you wasting your money upon me, like this." "It is no waste, if it afford you pleasure." "It is pleasure. I dearly love flowers." "To give pleasure," said Mr. Lowler, "is a great object of my life. If I could assure you happiness, if you would allow me hope, to seize this opportunity now that we are alone together." He drew near and caught her hand. His features were agitated. His lips trembled. There was earnestness in his eyes. At once a cold blast touched Julia and began to circle around her and flutter her hair. She trembled and drew back. That paralyzing experience was about to be renewed. She turned deathly white and put her hand up to her right ear. "Oh, James, James," she gasped, do not speak what you want to say, or I shall faint. It is coming. I am not yet well enough to hear it. Write to me and I will answer. For pity's sake, do not speak it." And she sank upon a seat. At that moment her aunt entered the conservatory. On the following day a note was put into her hand, containing a formal proposal from the Hon, James Lowler. And by return of post Julie answered with an acceptance. There was no reason whatever why the engagement should be long. The only alternative mooted was whether the wedding should take place before Lent or after Easter. Finally, it was settled that it should be celebrated on Shrove Tuesday. This left a short time for the necessary preparations. Miss Fleming would have to go to town with her niece concerning a trousseau, and a trousseau is not turned out rapidly any more than an armed cruiser. There is usually a certain period allowed to young people who have become engaged to see much of each other, to get better acquainted with one another, to build their castles in the air, and to indulge in little passages of acceptance, vulgarly called spooning. But in this case, the spooning had to be curtailed and postponed. At the onset, when alone with James, Julie was nervous. She feared a reoccurrence of those phenomena that so affected her. But although every now and again the wind curled and sought her, it was not violent, nor was chilling, and she came to regard it as a wail of discomfiture. Moreover, there was no reoccurrence of the detonation, and she fondly hoped that with her marriage the vexation would completely ease. But in her heart was deep down a sense of exultation. She was defying James Hattersley and setting his prediction at naught. She was not in love with Mr. Lowler. She liked him in her cold manner, and was not insensible to the social advances that would be hers when she became the Honorable Mrs. Lowler. The day of the wedding arrived. Happily, it was fine. "Blessed is the bride the sun shines on," said the cheery Miss Fleming, "an omen, I trust, of a bright and unruffled life in your new condition." All the neighborhood was present at the church. Miss Fleming had many friends. Miss Lowler had fewer present, as he belonged to a distant county. The church path had been laid with red cloths, the church decorated with flowers, and a choir was present to twitter "The Voice That Breathed O'er Eden." The rector stood by the altar, and 2 cushions had been laid on the chancel step. The rector was to be assisted by an uncle of the bridegroom, who was in holy orders. The rector, being old-fashioned, had drawn on pale gray kid gloves. First arrived the bridegroom, with his best man, stood in nervous condition, balancing himself first on one foot and then on the other, waiting, observed by all eyes. Next entered the procession of the bride, attended by her maids, to the wedding march in Lohengrin on a wheezy organ. Then Julia and her intended took their places at the chancel step for the performance of the first portion of the ceremony, and the 2 clergy descended to them from the altar. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" "I will." wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband? I will. I, James, take thee, Julia, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold, and so on. As the words were spoken, a cold rush of air passed over the clasped hands, numbing them, and began to creep around the bride, and to flutter her veil. She set her lips and knitted her brows. In a few minutes she would be beyond the reach of these manifestations. When it came her turn to speak, she began firmly. I, Julia, take these, James. But as she proceeded, the wind became fierce. It raged about her. It caught her veil on one side and buffeted her cheek. It switched the veil about her throat, as though strangling her with a drift of snow, contracting into ice. But she persevered to the end. Then James Lowther produced the ring. I was about to place it on her finger, with the prescribed words, "With this ring I thee wed," when a report rang in her ear, followed by a heaving of her skull, as though the bones were being burst asunder, and she sank unconscious on the chancel step. In the midst of profound commotion, she was raised and conveyed to the vestry, followed by James Lowther, trembling and pale. He had slipped the ring into his waistcoat pocket. Dr. Crate, who was present, hastened to offer his professional assistance. In the vestry, Julia rested in a Glastonbury chair, white and still, with her hand rested on her lap. To the amazement of those present, it was seen that on the third ring of her left hand was a leaden ring. Third finger of her left hand was a leaden ring, rude and solid as though fashioned out of a bullet. Restoratives were applied, but a full quarter of an hour elapsed before Julia opened her eyes, and a little color returned to her lips and cheek. But as she raised her hands to her brow to wipe away the damps that had formed on them, her eye caught sight of the leaden ring, and with a cry of horror she sank again into insensibility. The congregation slowly left the church, awestruck and whispering, asking questions, receiving no satisfactory answers, forming surmises all incorrect. I am very much afraid, Mr. Lowther, said the rector, that it will be impossible to proceed with the service today. It must be postponed until Miss Devant is in condition to conclude her part and to sign the register. I do not see how it can be gone on with today. She is quite unequal to the effort. The carriage which was to have conveyed the couple to Miss Fleming's house and then later to have taken them to the station for their honeymoon, the horses decorated with white rosettes, the whip adorned with a white bow, had now to convey Julia, hardly conscious, supported by her aunt, to her home. Hi, Kingzilla. Nice to have you in the chat. So we're getting close to finishing the story of the leaden ring. No rice could be thrown. The bell ringers, prepared to give joyous peal, were constrained to depart. The reception at Miss Fleming's was postponed. No one thought of attending. The cakes, the ices, were consumed in the kitchen. The bridegroom, bewildered, almost frantic, ran hither and thither, not knowing what to do, what to say. Julia lay as a stone for fully 2 hours, and when she came to herself she could not speak. Unconscious, she raised her left hand, looked at the leaden ring, and sank back again into senselessness. Not until late in the evening was she recovered sufficiently to speak, and then she begged her aunt, who had remained by her bed without stirring, to dismiss the attendants. She desired to speak with her alone. When no one was in the room with her, save Miss Fleming, she said in a whisper, "Oh, Aunt Elizabeth, oh, Auntie, such an awful thing has happened. I can never marry Mr. Lowther, never. I have married James Hattersley. I am a dead man's wife." At the time that James Lowther was making the responses, I heard a piping voice in my ear, an unearthly voice saying the same words. When I said, "I, Julia, take you, James, to my wedded husband," but you know Mr. Hattersley is James as well as Mr. Lowther, then the words applied to him as much or as well as to the other. And then when it came to give the ring, there was the explosion in my ear, as before, and the leaden ring was forced onto my finger. It could not be James Lowther's golden ring. It is of no use to my resisting any more. I am a dead man's wife, and cannot marry James Lowther. Some years have elapsed since that disastrous day and that incomplete marriage. Miss Demont is Miss Demont still, and she has never been able to remove the leaden ring from the third finger of her left hand. Whenever the attempt has been made, either to disengage it by drawing it off or by cutting through it, there has ensued that terrifying discharge of a gun in her ear, causing insensibility. The prostration that has followed, the terror it has inspired, have so affected her nerves that she has desisted from every attempt to rid herself of the ring. She invariably wears a glove over her left hand. It is bulged over the third finger, where lies that leaden ring. She is not a happy woman, although her aunt is dead and has left her a handsome estate. She has not got many acquaintances. She has no friends, for her temper is unamiable and her tongue is bitter. She supposes that the world, as far as she knows it, is in league against her. Towards the memory of James Hattersley, she entertains a deadly hate. If an incantation could lay his spirit, if a prayer could give him repose, she would have recourse to none of these expedients. Even though they might relieve her, so bitter is her resentment, and she harbors a silent wrath against Providence for allowing the dead to walk and molest the living. And that is The Leaden Ring by Sabine Baring-Gould. I'm going to give my eyes a moment to rest there. That particular place I'm reading it from is bright and vivid and very, very light mode. And boy, oh boy, I am not used to being a light mode boy. Thank you very much. Let's see what else I have here. Now that one took a little longer than I thought it would. That was about a half an hour for that story. Here's a new one. This looks a little bit shorter. This is called The Man with Two Lives by Ambrose Bierce. Here is the queer story of David William Duck, related by himself. Duck is an old man living in Aurora, Illinois, where he is universally respected. He is commonly known, however, as Dead Duck. In the autumn of 1866, I was a private soldier of the 18th Infantry. My company was one of those stationed at Fort Phil, Kearney, commanded by Colonel Carrington. The country is more or less familiar with the history of that garrison, particularly with the slaughter of the Sioux, of a detachment of 81 men and officers, not one escaping. Through the disobedience of orders by its commander, the brave but reckless Captain Fetterman. When that occurred, I was trying to make my way with important dispatches to Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn. A sec here. As the country swarmed with hostile Indians, I traveled by night and concealed myself as best I could before daybreak. The better to do so, I went afoot, armed with a Henry rifle and carrying 3 days' rations in my haversack. For a second place of concealment, I chose what seemed in the darkness a narrow cañon leading through a range of rocky hills. It contained many large boulders detached from the slopes of the hill. Behind one of these, in a clump of sagebrush, I made my bed for the day, and soon fell asleep. It seemed as if I had hardly closed my eyes, though in fact it was near midday, when I was awakened by the report of a rifle, bullets striking the boulder just above my body. A band of Indians had trailed me and had nearly surrounded. The shot had been fired with execrable aim by a fellow who had caught sight of me from the hillside above. The smoke of his rifle betrayed him, and I was no sooner on my feet than he was off his and rolling down into the declivity. Then I ran in a stooping posture, dodging among the clumps of sagebrush in a storm of bullets from invisible enemies. The rascals did not rise in pursuit, which I thought rather queer, for they must have known by my trail that they had to deal with only one man. The reason for their inaction was soon made clear. I had not gone 100 yards before I reached the limit of my run, the head of a gulch, which I had mistaken for a common. It terminated into a concave breast of rock, nearly vertical and destitute of vegetation. In that cul-de-sac I was caught like a bear in a pen. Pursuit was needless, they had only to wait. They waited for 2 days and nights, crouching behind a rock, topped with a growth of mesquite, and with the cliff at my back, suffering agonies of thirst and absolutely hopeless of deliverance. I fought the fellows at long range, firing occasionally at the smoke of their rifles, as they did at that of mine. Of course, I dared not close my eyes at night. The lack of sleep was a keen torture. And I remember on the morning of the third day, which I knew was to be my last, I remember rather distinctly that in my desperation and delirium I sprang out into the open and began firing my repeating rifle without seeing anybody to fire at. And I remember no more of that fight. The next thing that I recollect was pulling myself out of a river just at nightfall. I had not a rag of clothing and knew nothing of my whereabouts, but all that night I traveled, cold and footsore, toward the north. At daybreak I found myself at Fort C.F. Smith, my destination, but without my dispatches. The first man I met was a sergeant named William Briscoe, whom I knew very well. You can fancy his astonishment at seeing me in that condition, and my own at his asking who the devil I was. Dave Duck, I answered. Who should I be? He stared like an owl. You do look it, he said, and I observed that he drew a little away from me. What's up? He added. I told him what had happened to me the day before. He heard me through, still staring, and then he said, My dear fellow, if you are Dave Duck, I ought to inform you that I buried you 2 months ago. I was out with a small scouting party and found your body full of bullet holes and newly scalped. Somewhat mutilated otherwise, too, I am sorry to say, right where you say you made your fight. Come to my tent and I'll show you your clothing and some letters I took from your person. The commandant has your dispatches. He performed that promise. He showed me the clothing, which I resolutely put on. The letters, which I put into my pocket. He made no objection, then took me to the commandant, who heard my story and coldly ordered Briscoe to take me to the guardhouse. On the way, I said, Bill Briscoe, do you really and truly bury the dead body? Did you really and truly bury that dead body you found in these trogs? Sure, he said. Just as I told you. It was Dave Duck, all right. Most of us knew him. And now, you damned imposter, you'd better tell me who you are. I'll give you something to know, I said. A week later, I escaped from the guardhouse and got out of the country as fast as I could. Twice I have been back, seeking for that fateful spot on the hill, but unable to find it. And that is The Man with Two Lives by Ambrose Bierce. Thank you. Next, let's read The Spectral Bride by William Harrison Ainsworth. The castle of Hernswolf, at the close of the year 1655, was the resort of fashion and gaiety. The baron of that name was the most powerful nobleman in Germany, and equally celebrated for the patriotic achievements of his sons, and the beauty of his only daughter. The estate of Hernswolf, which was situated in the center of the Black Forest, has been given to one of his ancestors by the gratitude of the nation, and descended with other hereditary possessions to the family of the present owner. It was a castellated Gothic manor, built according to the fashion of the times, in the grandest style of architecture, and consisted primarily of dark winding corridors, vaulted tapestry rooms, magnificent indeed in their size but ill-suited to private comfort, from the very circumstance of their dreary magnitude. A dark grove of pine and mountain ash accompanied the castle on every side, and threw an aspect of gloom around the scene, which was seldom enlivened by the cheering sunshine of heaven. The castle bells rung out a merry peal at the approach of a winter twilight, and the warder was stationed with his retinue on the battlements to announce the arrival of the company, who were invited to share the amusements that reigned within the walls. Lady Clotilda, the Baron's only daughter, had but just attained her 17th year, and a brilliant assembly was invited to celebrate the birthday. The large vaulted apartments were thrown open for the reception of the numerous guests, and the gaiety of the evening had scarcely commenced when the clock from the dungeon tower was heard to strike with unusual solemnity. And on the instant a tall stranger, arranged in a deep suit of black, made his appearance in the ballroom. He bowed courteously on every side, but was received by all with the strictest reserve. None knew whom he was or whence he came, but it was evidence from his appearance that he was a nobleman of the first rank. Although his introduction was accepted with distrust, he was treated with all respect. He addressed himself particularly to the daughter of the Baron, and was so intelligent in his remarks, so lively in his sallies, and so fascinating in his address, that he quickly interested the feelings of his young and sensitive auditor. In fine, after some hesitation on the part of the host, who, with the rest of the company, was unable to approach the stranger with indifference, he was requested to remain a few days at the castle, an invitation which was cheerfully accepted. The dead of the night drew on, and when all had retired to rest, the dull, heavy bell was heard swinging to and fro in the grey tower, although there was scarcely a breath to move on the forest trees. Many of the guests, when they met the next morning at the breakfast table, averred there had been some sounds of the most heavenly music, while all persisted in affirming that they heard awful noises proceeding, as it seemed, from the apartment which the stranger at time occupied. He soon, however, made his appearance at the breakfast table, and when the circumstances of the preceding night were alluded to, a dark smile of unutterable meaning played across his saturnine features, and then relapsed into an expression of deepest melancholy. He addressed his conversation principally to Clotilde, and when he talked of the different climes he had visited, of the sunny regions of Italy, where the very air breathes the fragrances of flowers, and the summer breeze sighs over the land of sweets, when he told her of those delicious countries, when the smile of the day sinks to the softer beauty of the night, and the loveliness of heaven is never an instant obscured, he drew tears of regret from the bosom of his fair auditor, and the first time she regretted that she was yet at home. Days rolled on, and every moment increased the fervor of the inexpressible sentiments with which the stranger had inspired her. He never discoursed love, but he looked it in his language, in his manner, and in the insinuating tones of his voice, and the slumbering softness of his smile. When he found that he had succeeded in inspiring her with favorable sentiments, a sneer of the most diabolical meaning spoke for an instant and died again on his dark-featured countenance. When he met her in the company of her parents, he was at once respectful and submissive, and it was only when alone with her, in her ramble through the dark recesses of the forest, that he assumed the guise of the more impassioned admirer. As he was sitting one evening with the Baron in the wainscoted apartment of the library, the conversation happened to turn upon supernatural agency. The stranger remained reserved and mysterious during the discussion, but when the Baron, in a jocular manner, denied the existence of spirits and satirically mocked their appearance, his eyes glowed with an unearthly luster, and his form seemed to dilate to more than its natural dimensions. When the conversation had ceased, a fearful pause of a few seconds and a chorus of celestial harmony was heard pealing through the dark forest glade. All were entranced with the light, but the stranger was disturbed and gloomy. He looked at his noble host with compassion, and something like a tear swam in his dark eye. After the lapse of a few seconds, the music gently died in the distance, and all was hushed as before. The Baron soon after quitted the apartment, and was followed almost immediately by the stranger. He had not long been absent when an awful noise, as of a person in the agonies of death, was heard, and the Baron was discovered stretched dead along the corridors. His countenance was convulsed with pain, and the grip of a human hand was visible on his blackened throat. The alarm was instantly given, the castle searched in every direction, but the stranger was seen no more. The body of the Baron, in the meantime, was quietly committed to the earth, and the remembrance of the dreadful transaction recalled as but a thing that once was. After the departure of the stranger, who had indeed fascinated her very senses, the spirits of the gentle Clotilda evidently declined. She loved to walk early and late in the walks that he had once frequented, to recall his last words, to dwell on his sweet smile, to wander to the spot where she had once discoursed with love of him. She avoided all society and never seemed to be happy when left alone in the solitude of her chamber. It was then she gave vent to her affection in tears. The love that the pride of maiden modesty concealed in public burst forth in the hours of privacy. That's an interesting sentence. So beauteous yet so resigned was the fair mourner that she seemed already an angel freed from the trammels of the world, and prepared to take her flight to heaven. As she was one summer evening rambling to the sequestering spot that had been selected as her favorite residence, a slow step advanced towards her. She turned round and, to her infinite surprise, discovered the stranger. He stepped gaily to her side and commenced an animated conversation. "You left me," she exclaimed the delighted girl, "and I thought all happiness was fled from me forever. But you return, and shall we not be happy?" "Happy," replied the stranger, with a scornful burst of derision. "Can I ever be happy again? Can there but the excuse of agitation, my love, and to impute it to the pleasure I experienced in our meeting? Oh, I have many things to tell you, aye, and many kind words to receive. Is it not so, sweet one? Come, tell me truly, have you been happy in my absence?" "No, I see that sunken eye, and that pallid cheek. The poor wanderer has gained some slight interest in the heart of his beloved. I have roamed to other climes, I have seen other nations, I have met with other females, beautiful and accomplished, but I have met with but one angel, and she is here before me. Accept this simple offering of my affection, dearest," continued the stranger, plucking a hearth rose from its stem. "It is beautiful as the wild flowers that deck thy hair, as sweet as the love I bear thee." "It is sweet indeed," replied Clotilda, "but its sweetness must wither ere night closes around. It is beautiful, but its beauty is short-lived, as is the love evinced by man. Let not this, then, be the type of thy attachment. Bring me the delicate evergreen, the sweet flower that blooms throughout the year, and I will say, as I wreath it in my hair, the violets have bloomed and died, the roses have flourished and decayed, but the evergreen is still young, and so is the love of heart. You will not, cannot desert me. I live but in you. You are my hopes, my thoughts, my existence itself. And if I lose you, I lose my all. I was but a solitary wild flower in the wilderness of nature, until you transplanted me to a more genial soil. And can you now break the fond heart you first taught to glow with passion?" "Speak not thus," returned the stranger. "It rends my very soul to hear you. Leave me, forget me, avoid me forever, or your eternal ruin must ensue. I am a thing abandoned by God and man." "And did you but see the sacred heart that scarcely beats within this moving mass of deformity, you would flee me as you would an adder in your path. Here is my heart, love. Feel how cold it is. There is no pulse that betrays its emotion, for it is all chilled and dead as the friends I once knew. You are unhappy, love, and your poor Clotilda shall stay to succor you. Sorry. Think not I can abandon you to your misfortunes. No, I will wander with thee through the wide world, and be thy servant, thy slave, if thou wilt have it so. I will shield thee from the night winds, that they will not blow too roughly on thy unprotected head. I will defend thee from the tempest that howls, and though the cold winds may devote thy name to scorn, though friends may fall off, and associates may wither in the grave, there shall be one fond heart who shall love thee better in thy misfortunes, and cherish thee, bless thee still. She ceased, and her blue eyes swam in tears. As she turned, it glistened with affection towards the stranger. He averted his head from her gaze, and a scornful sneer of the darkest, meanest malice passed over his fine countenance. In an instant, the expression subsided. His fixed glassy eye resumed its unearthly chillness, and he turned once again to his companion. "It is the hour of sunset," he exclaimed, "the soft, beauteous hour, when the hearts of lovers are happy, and nature smiles in unison with their feelings. But to me it will smile no longer. Ere the morrow dawns I shall be very far from the house of my beloved, from the scenes where my heart is enshrined as in a sepulchre. But I must leave thee, dearest flower of the wilderness, to be a sport of a whirlwind, the prey of the mountain blast?" "No, we will not part," replied the impassioned girl. "Where thou goest, I will go, and thy home will be my home, and thy God shall be my God." Swear it," resumed the stranger, wildly grasping her by the hand. Swear to the fearful oath I shall dictate." He then desired her to kneel, and holding his right hand in a menacing attitude towards heaven, and throwing back his dark raven locks, exclaimed in a strain of bitter imprecation, with a ghastly smile of an incarnate fiend, "May the curses of an offended God," he cried, "haunt thee, cling to thee, for forever in the tempest and the calm, in the day and in the night, in sickness and in sorrow, in life and death. Shouldst thou swerve from the promise thou hast made here to be mine. May the dark spirits of the damned howl in thy ears, the accursed chorus of fiends. May the air rack thy bosom with quenchless flames of hell. May thy soul be as the lazar house of corruption, where the ghost of the departed pleasure sits enshrined as in a grave, where the hundred-headed worm never dies, where the fire is never extinguished. May the spirit of evil lord over thy brow and proclaim, as thou wilt passest, this is the abandoned of God and man. May the fearful specters haunt thee in the night season. May thy dearest friends drop day by day into the grave and curse thee with their dying breath. May all that is most horrible in human nature, more solemn than language can frame or lips can utter, may this and more than this be thy eternal portion, shouldst thou violate the oath that thou hast taken." He ceased, hardly knowing that she, the terrified girl, acceded to the awful adjuration, and promised eternal fidelity to him who was henceforth to be thy lord. "Spirits of the damned, I thank thee for thine assistance," shouted the stranger. "I have wooed my fair lady bravely. She is mine, mine forever. Aye, body and soul both mine, mine in life and mine in death. But in tears, my sweet one, ere yet the honeymoon is past? Why, indeed, thou hast cause for weeping. When we next meet, we shall sign the nuptial bond." He then imprinted a cold salute on the cheek of his young bride, and softening down the unutterable horrors of his countenance, he requested her to meet him at 8 o'clock on the ensuing evening, in the chapels adjoining the castle, joining to the castle of Hernswolf. She turned round to him with a burning sigh, as if to implore protection from himself. The stranger was gone. Sorry, start my line. Upon entering the castle, she was observed to be impressed with the deepest melancholy. Her relations vainly endeavored to ascertain the cause of her uneasiness, but the tremendous oath she had sworn had completely paralyzed her faculties. She was fearful of betraying herself by even the slightest intonation of her voice, or the least variable expression of her countenance. When the evening was concluded, her family retired to rest, but Clotilda, who was unable to take repose from the restlessness of her disposition, requested to remain alone in the library that adjoined her apartment. All was now deep midnight. Every domestic had long since retired to rest, and the only sound that could be distinguished was the sullen howl of the band dog as he bayed. The waning moon, Clotilda remained in the library in an attitude of deep meditation. The lamp that burned on the table where she sat was dying away, and the other end of the apartment was already more than half obscured. The clock on the northern angle of the castle tolled out the hour of 12, and the sound echoed dismally in the solemn stillness of the night. Suddenly, the oaken door at the further end of the room was gently lifted on its latch, and a bloodless figure, upheld from the habiliments of the grave, advanced slowly up the apartment. No sound heralded its approach as it moved with noiseless steps to the table where the lady was stationed. She did not at first perceive it till she felt a death-cold hand grasp her own, and heard a solemn voice whisper in her ear. Clotilda, she looked up. A dark figure was standing beside her. She endeavored to scream, but her voice was unequal to the exertion. Her eye was fixed, as if by magic, to the form which slowly removed the garb that concealed its countenance and disclosed the livid eyes and skeletal shape of her father. It seemed to gaze on her with pity and regret, and mournfully exclaimed, "Clotilda, the dresses and servants are ready. The church bell has tolled. The priest is at the altar. Where is the affianced bride? There is room for her in the grave, and tomorrow she shall be with me." "Tomorrow?" faltered out the distracted girl. "The spirits of hell have resigned it, and tomorrow must the bond be cancelled." The figure ceased, slowly retired, and was soon lost in the obscurity of distance. The evening, arrived, and already the hall clock struck 8. Clotilda was on her road to the chapel. It was a dark, gloomy night. Thick masses of dun clouds sailed across the firmament, and the roar of the winter wind echoed awfully through the forest trees. She reached the appointed place. A figure was waiting for her. It advanced, and she discovered the features of the stranger. "Why, this is well, my bride," he exclaimed with a sneer, "and well will I repay thy fondness. Follow me." They proceeded together in silence through the winding avenues of the chapel until they reached the adjoining cemetery. Here they paused for an instant, and the stranger, in a softened tone, said, "But 1 hour more, and the struggle will be over. And yet this heart of incarnate malice can feel when it devotes so young, so pure a spirit to the grave. But it must be," he proceeded, as the memory of her love past rushed in her mind. "For the theme whom I obey has so willed it. Poor girl, I am leading thee indeed to our nuptials. But the priest will be dead, thy parents molding skeletons that rot in heaps around, and the witnesses to our union, lazy worms that revel in the carrion bones of the dead. Come, my young bride, the priest is impatient for his victim." As they proceeded, a dim blue light moved swiftly between them, and displayed the extremity of the churchyard and portions of the vault. It was open, and they entered in silence. The hollow wind came rushing through the gloomy abode of the dead, and on every side were piled the molding remains of coffins, which dropped piece by piece upon the damp mud. Every step they took on Every step they took was on a dead body, and the bleached bones rattled awfully beneath their feet. In the center of the vault rose a heap of unburied skeletons, whereon was seated a figure too awful even in the darkest imagination to conceive. As they approached, the hollow vault rung with a hellish peal of laughter, and every molding corpse seemed endued with unholy life. The stranger paused, and as he grasped his victim by the hand, one sigh burst from his heart. One tear glistened in his eye. It was but for an instant. The figure frowned awfully at his vacillation, and waved his gaunt hand. The stranger advanced. He made certain mystic circles in the air, uttered unearthly words, and paused in excess of terror. On a sudden he raised his voice and wildly exclaimed, "Spouse of the spirit of darkness, a few moments are yet mine, that thou mayst know to whom thou hast consigned thyself. I am the undying spirit of the wretch who cursed his Savior on the cross. He looked at me in the closing hour of his existence, and hath not yet passed away. I am cursed above all on earth. I am eternally condemned to hell, and must cater for my master's taste, till the world is parched as is a scroll, and the heavens and earth have passed away. I am he of whom thou mayst have read, and of whose feats thou mayst have heard. 1,000,000 souls has my master condemned me to ensnare, and then my penance is accomplished, and I may know the repose of the grave. Thou art the 1,000th soul I have damned. I saw thee in thy hour of purity, and marked thee at once for my home. Thy father I did murder for his timidity, and permitted to warn thee of thy fate, and myself I have beguiled for thy simplicity. Ha! The spell works bravely, and thou shalt soon see, my sweet one, to whom thou hast linked thine undying fortunes. For as long as the seasons shall move on their course of nature, as long as the lightning shall flash, as the thunders roll, the penance shall be eternal. Look below, and see to what thou art destined." She looked, and the vault split in 1,000 different directions. The earth yawned asunder, and the roar of mighty waters was heard. A living ocean of molten fire glowed in the abyss beneath her, blending with the shrieks of the damned and the triumphant shouts of fiends, rendered horror more horrible than imagination. 10,000,000 souls were writhing in the fiery flames, and then as the boiling billows dashed them against the blackened rocks of adamant, they cursed with blasphemies of despair, and each curse echoed in thunder across the wave. The stranger rushed towards his victim. For an instant he held her over the burning vista, looked fondly into her face, and wept as he were a child. This was but the impulse of the moment. Again he grasped her in his arms, dashed her from him with fury, and as her last parting glance was cast in kindness on his face, shouted aloud, "Not mine is the crime, but the religion that thou professest. For it is not said that there is a fire of eternity prepared for the souls of the wicked, and hast not thou incurred its torments?" She, poor girl, heard not, indeed, not the shouts of the blasphemer. Her delicate form bounded from rock to rock, over billow and over foam as she fell. The ocean lashed itself as if it were triumphant to receive her soul, and she sank deep into the burning pit. 10,000 voices reverberated from the bottomless abyss. "Spirit of evil, here indeed is an eternity of torments prepared for thee, for here the worm never dies, and the fire is never quenched." And that is The Spectre Bride by William Harrison Ainsworth. Hope you're having a good time with this, chat. It's fun and interesting reading these stories. I haven't read many of them before, hence my stumbling over some of the words. but I am trying to do the stories justice and have a little bit of fun along the way. My oh my, I do regret so many stories that have a light mode webpage that are absolutely just frying my eyes. Get a little stretch in here. Let's move on to the next story, called A Midnight Visitor by John Kendrick Bangs. I do not assert that what I am about to relate is in all its particulars absolutely true. Not understand me that it is not true, but that I do not feel that I care to make an assertion that is more than likely to be received by a skeptical age with sneers of incredulity. I will content myself with simple narration of the events of that evening, a memory of which is so indelibly impressed upon my mind, and which, were I able to do so, I should forget with any sentiments or of regret whatsoever. The affair happened on the night before I fell ill of typhoid fever, and is about the sole remaining remembrance of that immediate period left to me. Briefly, the story is as follows. Notwithstanding the fact that I was overworked in the practice of my profession, it was early in March, and I was preparing my contributions for the coming Christmas issues of the periodicals for which I write. I had accepted the highly honorable position of entertainment committeeman at one of the small clubs to which I belong. I accepted the office, supposing that the duties connected with it were easy of performance, and with absolutely no notion of the faith of my fellow committeemen in my judgment was so strong that they would ultimately manifest a desire to leave the whole program for the club's diversion in my hands. This, however, they did, and when the month of March assumed the command of the calendar, I found myself utterly fagged out, and at my wit's end to know what style of entertainment to provide for the club meeting to be held on the evening of the 15th of that month. I had provided already an unusual taking variety of evenings, of which one in particular, called the Martyr's Night, in which living authors writhe through sections of their own work, while an inhuman audience, every man whom had suffered even as victims then suffered, sat in 10 score of camp stools, puffing the smoke of 25 score of free cigars onto their faces, and gloating over their misery, which was extremely successful, and had gained for me among my professional brethren the title of Machiavelli Jr. This performance was, in fact, the one now uppermost in the minds of the club members, having been the most recent of the series, and it had been prophesied by many men whose judgment was unassailable, that no man could, not even I, could conceive of anything that could surpass it. Disposed at first to question the accuracy of a prophecy that was to the effect that I was, like most of others of my kind, possessors of limitations, I came to finally to believe that perhaps after all, these male Cassandras with whom I was thrown were right. Indeed, the more I racked my brains to think of something better than the Martyr's Night, the more I became convinced that the achievement that achievement had I had that in that achievement I had reached the zenith of my powers. The thing for me to do now was to hook myself securely to the zenith and stay there. But how to do it? That was the question which drove sleep from my eyes and deprived me for a period of 6 weeks of my reason, my hair departing immediately upon the restoration thereof, a not uncommon after symptom of typhoid. It was a typical March night, this one upon which the extraordinary incident about to be related took place. It was the kind of night that novelists use when they are handling a mystery that in the abstract word amount to nothing, but which the concrete of a bit of wild, weird, and windy nocturnalism sends the reader into hysterics. It may be, I shall not admit to deny it, that it happened upon another kind of evening. A soft, mild, balmy June evening, for instance. My own experience would have seemed less worthy of preservation than the amber of publicity, but the reader must judge for himself. The fact alone remains that upon the night when my uncanny visitor appeared, the weather department was apparently engaged in getting rid of its remnants. There was a large percentage of withering blast in the general makeup of the evening. There were rain and snow, which alternated in pattering upon my window pane and whitening the apology for a world that stands 3 blocks for a wold that stands 3 blocks from my flat on Madison Square. The wind whistled as it always does upon the occasions of this sort, and from all corners of my apartment, after the usual fashion, there seemed to come sounds of supernatural order, the effect of which was to send cold chills off on their regular trips up and down the spines of their victim, in this instance myself. I wish that the time of the hackneyed quality of these sensations had appealed to me. That it did not do so was shown by the highly nervous state in which I found myself as the clock struck 11. If I could only have realized that hour that these symptoms were the same old threadbare premonitions of the appearance of a supernatural being, I should have left the house and gone to the club, and so have avoided the visitation then imminent. Had I done this, I should doubtless have escaped the typhoid, since the doctors attributed the misfortune to the shock of my experience, which in my wearied state, I was unable to sustain, and what the escape of typhoid would have meant to me, only those who have seen the bills of my physician and druggist for services rendered and prescriptions compounded are aware. That my mind unconsciously took the thought of spirits was shown by the fact that when the first call came upon me, I rose and poured out for myself a stiff bumper of old reserve rye, which I then immediately swallowed. But beyond this I do not simply go. I simply sat before my fire and cudgeled my brains for an idea whereby my fellow members at the Gutenberg Club might be amused. How long I sat there I do not know. It may have been 10 minutes, it may have been an hour. I was barely conscious of the passing of time, but I do know that the clock on the Dutch Reformed Church steeple at the 29th Street and 5th Avenue was clanging out the first stroke of the hour of midnight when my doorbell rang. Theretofore, if it may be allowed the word, tintinnabulation of my doorbell had been invariably pleasing to me. I am fond of company, and company alone was betokened by its ringing, since my creditors gratifying their passions for interviews at my office, if perchance they happened to find me there. But on this occasion I could not for a moment tell why. Its clanging seemed the very essence of discord. It jangled with my nervous system, and as it ceased I was conscious of a feeling of irritability which is utterly at variance with my nature outside of business hours. In the office, for the sake of discipline, I frequently adopt a querulous nature, finding it necessary in dealing with office boys. The moment I leave the shop behind me, I become a different individual entirely, and have been called a motless sunbeam by those who've seen only that side of my character. This, by the way, must be regarded as a confidential communication, since I am at present engaged in preparing a vest pocket edition of the philosophical works of Schopenhauer in words of one syllable, and were it known that the publisher had entrusted the magnificent pessimism of that industrious juggler of words and theories to a motless sunbeam, it might seriously interfere with the sale of the work. And I must say, too, that the request that my confidence be respected is entirely disinterested, inasmuch as I decline to do the work on royalty plan, insisting upon the payment in a lump sum considerably in advance. But to return, I heard the bell ring with a sense of profound disgust. I did not wish to see anybody. My whiskey was low, my quinine pills few in number, and my chills alone were at present in profusion bordering upon ostentation. I'll pretend not to hear it, I said to myself, resuming my work of gazing at the flickering light of my fire, which, by the way, was the only light in the room. Ting-a-ling-ling, went the bell, as if to answer to my resolve. Confound the luck, I cried, jumping from my chair and going to the door with the intention of opening it, an intention, however, which was speedily abandoned, for as I approached it, a sickly fear came over me, a sensation that I had never known before seemed to take hold of my being, and instead of opening the door, I pushed the bolt to make it more secure. There's a hint of you, whoever you are, I cried. Do you hear that bolt slide, you? I added, tremulously, from the other side. There came no reply, only a more violent ringing of the bell. See here, I called, as loudly as I could. Who are you anyway? What do you want? There was no answer, except for the bell, which began again. Bell wire's too cheap to steal, I called again. If you want wire, go buy it. Don't try to pull mine out. It isn't mine anyhow. It belongs to the house. Still there was no reply, only the clanging of the bell, and then my curiosity overcame my fear, and with a quick movement I threw open the door. Are you satisfied now? I said angrily. But I addressed an empty vestibule. There was absolutely no one there, and I sat down on the mat and laughed. I never was so glad to see no one in my life. My laugh was short-lived. What made the bell ring? I suddenly asked myself. And then the feeling of fear came upon me. I gathered my somewhat shattered self together, sprang to my feet, slammed the door with such force that the corridors echoed from the sound, slid the bolt once more, turned the key, moved a heavy chair in front of it, and then fled like a frightened hare to the sideboard of my dining room. There I grasped the decanter holding my whiskey, seized a glass from the shelf, and started to pour out the usual dram when the glass fell from my hand and was shattered into 1,000 pieces on the hardwood floor. For as I poured, I glanced through the door, and there in my sanctum, the flicker of a random flame divulged in the form of a being, the eyes of whom seemed fixed on mine, piercing me through and through. To say that I was petrified was but a dim expression of the situation. I was granitized, and so remained until, by a far more luminous flicker from the burning wood, I perceived that the being wore a red, flaring necktie. He is human, I thought, and with the thought, the tension of my nervous system relaxed, and I was able to feel sufficiently well-developed sense of indignation to demand an explanation. This is a mighty cool proceeding on your part, I said, leaving the sideboard and walking into the sanctum. Yes, he replied, in a tone that made me jump. It was extremely sepulchral, a tone that seemed as if it might have been acquired in the damp corner of some cave off the earth. But it is a cool evening. I wonder what a man of your coolness doesn't hire himself out to some refrigerating company, I remarked, and with a sneer which could have delighted the soul of Cassius himself. I have thought it, returned the being calmly, but never went any further. Summer hotel proprietors have always outbid the refrigerating people, and they in turn have been laid low by the millionaires who have hired me on occasion to freeze out the people they don't like, but who have persisted in calling. I must confess, though, my dear Haram, that you are not much warmer yourself. This greeting is hardly what I expected. If you want to make me warmer, I retorted hotly, just keep on calling me Haram. How the deuce did you know of that blot on my etruscan? Anyhow, I added, for Haram was one of the crimes of my family that I had tried to conceal, my parents having fastened the name Haram Spencer Carrington upon me at baptism for no reason other than my rich bachelor uncle, who subsequently failed and became a charge upon me, was so named. I was standing at the door of the church when you were baptized, returned the visitor, and as you were an interesting baby, I kept an eye on you ever since. Of course, I knew you had discharged Haram as soon as you got old enough to put away childish things, and since the failure of your uncle, I had been aware that you desired to be known as Spencer Carrington. But to me, you are and have always been and always will be Haram. Well, don't give it away, I pleaded. I have to be famous someday. And if the American newspapers ever got a hold of the fact that once in my life I was Haram, I'd have to Haram to let me alone. Interesting. That's a bad joke, Haram, said the visitor, and for that reason I like it, though I don't laugh. There's no danger of your becoming famous if you stick to humor of that sort. Well, I'd like to know, I said, put in, my anger returning. I'd like to know who in Brindisi you are, what in Cairo you want, and what are the name of the 7 hinges of the gates of Singapore you are doing here at this time of night. When you were a baby, Haram, you had blue eyes, said my visitor. Bonny blue eyes, as the poet said. What of it, I asked. This, replied my visitor. If you have them now, you can very easily see what I am doing here. I am sitting down and talking to you. Oh, you are, I said in fine scorn. I had not observed that. The fact is, my eyes were so weakened by the brilliance of that necktie of yours, I doubt I could ever see anything, not even one of my own jokes. It is a scorcher, that tie of yours. In fact, I never saw anything so red in my life. I do not see why you complain of my tie, the visitor said. Your own is just as bad. Blue is never so withering as red, I retorted, at the same time caressing the scarf I wore. Perhaps not, but if you will look at the glass, Haram, you will observe that your point is not well taken, said my vis-a-vis calmly. I acted upon the suggestion and looked upon my reflection in the glass, lighting a match to facilitate the operation. I was horrified to observe that my beautiful blue tie, of which I was so proud, had in some manner changed. It was now the same aggressive hue as was that of my visitor, red even as a brick is red. To grasp it firmly in my hairs and tear it from my neck was the work of a moment, and then, in a spirit of rage, I turned upon my companion. See here, I cried, I've had quite enough of you. I can't make you out. I can't say what I want to. You know where the door is. You will oblige me by putting it to its proper use. Sit down, Haram, he said, and don't be foolish and ungrateful. You're behaving in a most extraordinary fashion, destroying your clothing and acting like a madman generally. What was the use of ripping up so handsome a tie like that? I despise loud hues. Red is a jockey's color, I answered. But you did not destroy the red tie, he said with a smile. You tore up your blue one. You tore up your blue one look. There it is on the floor, the red one you still have on. Investigation showed the truth of my visitor's assertion. The flaunting streamer of anarchy still made my neck infamous, and before me on the floor, In a most unrecognizable mass of shreds lay my cherished cerulean tie. The revelation stunned me. Tears came to my eyes, trickling over my cheeks, faintly hissed with the feverish heat of my flesh. My muscles relaxed, and I fell limp onto my chair. "You need stimulant," said my visitor kindly. "Go take a drop of your old reserve, and then come back here to me. I've something to say to you." "Will you join me?" I asked faintly. "No," returned the visitor. "I am so fond of whiskey that I never molest it. An act which is your stimulant is death to the rye. Never realized that, did you?" "No, I don't suppose I did," I said meekly. "And yet you claim to love it." "Bah," he said. And then I obeyed his command, drained my glass to the dregs, and returned. "What is your mission?" I asked when I had made myself as comfortable as was possible under the circumstances. "To relieve you of your woes." "You are a homeopath," I observed. I said with little sneer. "You're a homeopath in theory and an allopath in practice." "I am not unusually intelligent," he said. "I fail to comprehend your meanings. Perhaps you express yourself badly?" "I wish you to express yourself for Zululand," I retorted hotly. "What I mean is, you believe in the similibus business, but you prescribe large doses. I don't believe trouble like mine can be cured on your plan. A man can't rid his stock by adding to it." "Ah, I see. You think I have added to your troubles?" "I don't think so," I answered, with a fond glance at my ruined tie. "I know so." "Well, wait until I have laid my plan before you, and see if you won't change your mind," said my visitor significantly. "All right," I said. "Proceed, only hurry. I go to bed early as a rule, and it is getting quite early now." "It is only 1 o'clock," the visitor said, ignoring the sarcasm. "But I will hasten, as I have several other calls to make before breakfast." "Are you a milkman?" I asked. "You're flippant," he replied. "But Haram, I've come here to aid you in the spite of your unworthiness. You want to know what to provide your club on the night of the 15th. You want something that will knock the martyr's night silly." "Not exactly. I don't want anything so abominably good as to make all the things I have done seem failures. That's not good business." "Would you like to be hailed as the discoverer of genius? Would you like to be the responsible agent for the greatest exhibition of skill in a certain direction ever seen? Would you like to become the most famous impresario the world has ever known?" "Now," I said, forgetting my dignity under the enthusiasm with which I was inspired by my visitor's words, and infected more or less his undoubtedly magnetic spirit. "Now you're shouting." "I thought so, Haram. I thought so, and that's why I'm here. I saw you on Wall Street today, and read your difficulty at once in your eye, and resolved to help you. I am a magician, and 1 or 2 little things have happened of late to make me wish to prestidigitate in public. I knew you were after a show of some kind, and I've come to offer you my services." "Oh, pshaw," I said. "The members of the Gutenberg Club are men of brains, not children. Card tricks are hackneyed, and the sleight of hand shows pall." "Do they indeed?" said the visitor. "Well, mine won't. If you don't believe it, I'll prove to you what I can do." "I have no paraphernalia." "Well, I do," he said, and as he spoke, a pack of cards seemed to grow out of my hands. I must have turned pale at this unexpected happening. My visitor smiled and said, "Don't be frightened. That's only one of my tricks. Now choose a card," he added. "And when you have done so, toss the pack in the air. Don't tell me what the card is. It alone will fall to the floor." "Nonsense, that's impossible. Do as I tell you." I did as he told me, to a degree only. I tossed the cards in the air without choosing one, although I made a feint at doing so. Not a card fell back to the floor. Then everyone disappeared from view in the ceiling. If it had not been for the heavy chair I had rolled in front of the door, I should think I had fled. How's that for a trick? Asked the visitor. I said nothing, for the very good reason that my words were stuck in my throat. Give me a little creme de menthe, would you please? Said he, after a moment's pause. I haven't a drop in the house, I said, relieved to think that this wondrous being could come down to anything so earthy. Pshaw, Aram! He ejaculated, apparently in disgust. Don't be mean, and above all, don't lie. My man, you've got a bottle full of it in your hand. Do you want it all? And he was right. Where it came from I do not know, but beyond question, the gracefully slim-necked bottle was in my hand, and my left held a liqueur glass of exquisite form. Say, I gasped as soon as I was able to collect my thoughts. What are your terms? Wait a moment, he answered. Let me do a little mind reading before we arrange preliminaries. I'm afraid I don't have much of a mind to read tonight, I answered wildly. You're right there, he said. It's like a dime novel that your mind of yours tonight. But I'll do the best I can with it. I suppose you think of your favorite poem, and after turning it over in your mind carefully for a few minutes, select 2 lines, concealing them, of course, from me, and I will tell you what they are. Now, my favorite poem, I regret to say, is Lewis Carroll's Jabberwock, a fact which I was ashamed to confess to an utter stranger, and so tried to deceive him by thinking of some other lines. The effort was hardly successful, for the only other lines I could think to come to mind that moment were Rudyard Kipling's rhyme, The Post That Fitted, which ran, Year by year, in piteous patience, the vengeful Mrs. Boffin sits waiting for sleazily babies to develop sleazily fits. Huh! Ejacted my visitor. You're a great haram, you are. And then, rising from his chair and walking to my poet's corner, the magician selected 2 volumes. There, he said, handing me the departmental ditties. You'll find the lines you tried to fool me with at the foot of page 13. Look. I looked, and there lay that vile Sleary sentiment, in all the majesty of type, staring at me in the eyes. And here, added my visitor, opening Alice in the looking-glass, here is the poem that your mind holds. Here is the poem that to your mind holds all the philosophy of life. Come to my arms, my beamish boy, he chortled in his joy. I blushed and trembled, blushed that he just should discover the weakness of my taste and tremble at his power. I don't blame you for coloring, said the magician. But I thought you said that the Gutenberg was made up of men of brains. Do you think you could stay on the rolls a month if they were aware that your poetic ideas were summed up in Jabberwocky and Sleary's fits? My taste might be far worse, I answered. Yes, it might. You might have stooped to liking some of your own verses. I ought really to congratulate you, I suppose, retorted the visitor, with a sneering laugh. This roused my ire again. Who are you, anyhow, that you should come here and take me to task? I demanded angrily. I'll like anything I please, and without your permission. I care more for the Peterkin papers than I do for Shakespeare. If I cared more for the Peterkin papers than I do for Shakespeare, I wouldn't be accountable to you, and that's all there is to it. Never mind who I am, said the visitor. Suffice to say that I am myself. You'll know my name soon enough. In fact, you will pronounce it involuntarily the first thing you do when you wake in the morning. And then... He shook his head ominously, and I felt myself grow rigid with fright in my chair. Now for the final trick, he said after a moment's pause. Think of where you would most like to be at this moment, and I'll exert my power to put you there. Only close your eyes first. I closed my eyes and wished. When I opened them, I was in the billiard room of the Gutenberg Club with Perkins and Thompson. For heaven's sake, Spencer, they said in surprise. Where did you drop in from? My man, you are as white as a sheet. What a necktie. Take it off. Grab hold of me, boys, and hold me fast, I pleaded, falling to my knees in terror. If you don't, I believe I'll die. The idea of returning to my sanctum was intolerably dreadful to me. Laughed the magician For even as I spoke to Perkins and Thompson, I found myself seated opposite my infernal visitor in my room once more. They couldn't keep you an instant with me summoning you back. His laughter was terrible, his frown was pleasanter, and I felt myself gradually losing control of my senses. Go? Leave me, or you'll have the crime of murder on your conscience. I have no he began, but I heard no more. That is the last I remember of that fearful night. I must have fainted and then fallen into a deep slumber. When I waked, it was morning, and I was alone, but undressed and in bed, unconscionably weak, and surrounded by medicine bottles of many kinds. The clock on the mantel on the other side of the room indicated that it was after 10 o'clock. Great Beelzebub, I cried, taking note of the hour. I have an engagement with Barlow at 9. And then a sweet-faced woman who, afterwards I learned, was a professional nurse, entered my room, and within an hour I realized 2 facts. One, that I had lain ill for many days, and that my engagement with Barlow was now 6 weeks unfulfilled. And the other, that my midnight visitor was none other than... And yet I don't know. His tricks are certainly worthy of that individual, but Perkins and Thompson asserted that I never entered the club that night. And surely if my visitor was Beelzebub himself, he would not have omitted so important a factor as the success of my actual presence in the billiard room on that occasion would have been. And besides, he was altogether too cool to have come from his reputed residence. Although I think the episode most unaccountable, particularly when I reflect that, while no trace of my visitor was discovered in my room the next morning, as my nurse tells me, my blue necktie was in reality found on the floor, crushed and torn into a shapeless bundle of frayed rags. As for the club entertainment, I am told, despite my absence, it was a wonderful success, redeemed from failure, the treasurer of the club said, by the voluntary services of a guest who secured the admittance on one of my cars and who executed some sleight of hand tricks that made the members tremble and whose mind-reading feats performed on the club's butler not only made it necessary for him to resign his office, but disclosed to the House Committee the whereabouts of several cases of rare wines which had mysteriously disappeared. The end. I like that one. That is A Midnight Visitor by John Kendrick Bangs. The unabridged version. That is genuinely a charming story. I like that. Thank you, King. Let's see. What else have I picked out that might be a good... This might be a good one for the season. The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet. At the small parlor of Lawburn Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and sons were at chess. The former, who possessed the ideas about the game involving radical changes, put his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was laid desirously preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," said the son. "It's the worst living so far out," bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because it's only 2 houses where the road's let in, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife, soothing. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thinning gray beard. There he is, said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps. As the gate banged, two loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed as gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. Sergeant Major Morris, he said, introducing himself. The Sergeant Major shook hands, taking the proffered seat by the fire and watching contentedly while his host got out whiskey in tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. You don't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely. Hello, Phantasm. Nice to have you. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man. Just to look around a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, sighing softly. Shook it again. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was it you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, the soldier said hastily. Leastways nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw? Said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a little bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, the Sergeant Major said offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and set it down again. The host filled it for him. To look at, said the Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket, is just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the Sergeant Major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their lit laughter jarred somewhat. Why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him the way middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotched face whitened. Did you really have 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? The first man had 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It's caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them. And those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterwards. But if you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, what would you have then? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and dangled it between his forefinger and thumb, and suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a sudden cry, stooped down and snatched it up. Better to let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it in the fire again like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? Hold up your right hand and whistle loud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from the pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look on it of alarm in his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned for his friend to the table. On the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterwards the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to the second installment of the soldiers' tales in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, he said, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretentious horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted around the corner, and, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me like I've got it all. If you only cleaned the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Hubert, with his hand on his shoulder. We'll wish for 200 pounds, then. That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefully at his own credulity, held up the talisman at his son. The solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran to him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. Must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man stared nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled in upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Hubert as he bid them good night, and something horrible squatting on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw at it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw. With a little shiver, he waved his hand on his coat and went to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which had lacked the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched to the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose all old soldiers are the same, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? If they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, father? Might drop his head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Moore said things happen so naturally, said his father, that you might have wished for it, that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Hubert as he rose from the table. I'm afraid you'll turn into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you. His mother laughed and followed him to the door and watched him down the road, returning to the breakfast table, and was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired old sergeant majors of bulbous habits when she found the post brought a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said, as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to. You thought it did, said the old lady, soothingly. I say it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be making up his mind to enter. In a mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed the stranger was well-dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he passed the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same time placed her hands behind her and hurried unfastening the strings of her apron so that put the useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which she usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call, he said at last, and stooped to pick up a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Hubert? What is it? What is it? There, mother, he said. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir, he said, he eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded his mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's perverted face. She caught her breath and turned from her slow-witted husband and laid her trembling hand upon his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery, repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat blankly out the window, taking his wife's hand between his own, breasted as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It's hard. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished for me to convey their sincere sympathy with you for your great loss, he said without looking around. I beg that you will understand that I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility. They admit to no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. How much? 200 pounds, was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped in a senseless heap to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could barely realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though something else had happened, something else which was to lighten this load too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and the expectation gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. I lost my place for a sec. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about. Their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. You will be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away in his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up with alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said. "You've not destroyed it?" "It's in the parlor, on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, bending over, kissed his cheek. "I've only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't they think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." Was that not enough? Was that not enough? He demanded fiercely. "No," she cried frantically. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and we'll wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she granted. "Get it quickly, and wish... Oh, my boy, my boy!" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Go back to bed," he said, unsteady. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. He was too terrible for you to see. Then how?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him towards the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door, his brow cold with sweat. He felt his way around the table and groped the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed to change as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look about it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, onto a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceilings and the walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to bed, and a minute or two after, the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. The stair creaked and a mouse squeaked, scurrying noisily through the wall. The dark was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took a box of matches, and striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another. At the same moment a knock, so quiet and so stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded from the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled into the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and swiftly fled back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What was that?" cried the old woman, standing up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her. Catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy, it's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door." "For God's sakes, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed her to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing got inside. A perfect fusilage of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of chain as his wife put down in the passage against the door. Then he heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at that moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased, and though the echoes of it were still in the house, he heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long wail of disappointment and then misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. And thank you for the raid, Myojin. Much appreciated. And Wilpen Gaming, thank you for dropping by as well. And Hot Shack, thank you so much. We just finished reading The Monkey's Paw by, as I can try to scroll up, by W.W. Jacobs. I hope you're enjoying it. Only 5 more until you get a nap. That's lovely. I'm very happy for your success. Yoji Deku. Very nice. Alright, what should we read next? Let's read The Ash Tree by M.R. James Montag Rhodes James. Bedtime spooky stories. It's spooky season with spooky outfit. But yes, The Ash Tree by M.R. James. Everyone who has traveled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they've always had a strong attraction, with the gray paling of the split oak, the noble trees, the mares with their red reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck to a red brick Queen Anne house, which has been fancied with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste at the end of the 18th century. The hall inside, going up to the roof, which the hall ought to have always been provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library, too, where you may find anything from a Psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like pictures, of course, and then perhaps most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was like when it was first built. And in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, not the least when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied and life is quite as interesting. I wish to have one of those houses and enough money to keep it together and to entertain my friends in modesty. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is Castringham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than out, park with fringe of wood and a mare. The one feature that marked out the house from a score of others is gone, though. If you look at it from the park, you saw on the right a great old ash tree growing within a half-dozen yards of the wall, almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose that it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling house built. At any rate, it was well nigh attained to its full dimensions in the year 1690. In the year, the district in which the house is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offense really did imagine they were possessed by unusual power of any kind, or whether they had the will, at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbors, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the cruelty of witch-finders. These are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved. And the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto-da-fé. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only by being rather better off and more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers from the parish. They did their best to testify to her character and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window, at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiar carved knife, and as she did, she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion, Mr. Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he made, and all he could see when he had gotten down to the garden was a hare running across the path in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night, he had been at pains to follow at his best speed and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had to wait a quarter of an hour banging at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed. He had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though, there was much more or less of striking and unusual kind from other parishioners. Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures at Bury St. Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, then deputy sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up to the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life, so in death, of a very different temper. For polysinus rage, as a reporter at the time puts it, did so much work on the bystanders, yet even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed that all that saw her, that she presented the living aspect of a mad devil. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law, only that she looked upon those who had laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that, as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said were seemingly meaningless words. "They will be a guest at the hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared then and afterwards that he could not have given any other account of the matter which he had given, that he could not have possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him, but he saw it a duty to be done with his business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at full, vicar and squire met again in the park and walked to the hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home. So the vicar, Mr. Crom, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on the family and parish matters, and as his luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of the regarding of his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Crome thought of starting for home about 9:30 o'clock, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk to the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crome was this. They were in sight of the ash tree, which I described as growing near the home of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is that runs up and down the stem of ash? Is it never a squirrel? They will all be in their nest by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its color in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn, he thought, though it sounded foolish, that, squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much more was to be made of the momentary vision, and the two men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day, Sir Matthew was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked on his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you had guessed. If there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then by his directions rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Crome himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown the room where the dead man lay. He has some notes among his papers to show genuine respect and sorrow was felt from Sir Matthew, but there is also this passage, for which I transcribe for the sake of light it throws upon the course of events, but also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend always would have it in this season. He had hung his evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it out. The drink was examined by the physician from Bury, a Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath, before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of venomous kind was present in it. For, as was natural in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse, there was talk made upon the neighbors of poison. The body was very much disordered as it laid in bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave to probable conjecture that my friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. Yet what is as yet unexplained to myself the argument of some horrid and artful design in the perpetration of this barbarous murder was this: the woman which were entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it both said Pearsons and very well respected in the mournful profession, came to me in great pain and distress, both of mind and body, saying that indeed that what was indeed confirmed upon the first viewing. They had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands that they were sensible of more than an ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which with their whole forearms in no less time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that afterwards proved during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, yet no mark was seen on their skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able to, by the help of the small magnifying lens of crystal, of the condition of the skin on this part of the body. But I could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which poison might have been introduced, remembering the ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of horrid art of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As I am told to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether or not there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, which my friend, punctual as in matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising to read a set portion, and taking it up, not without a tear paid duly to him which from the study of his poor adumbration, ooh, that's a word, was now passed to the contemplation of its great original. It came into my thoughts, as such moments of helplessness are prone to catch any least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old and by many accounted superstitious practice of drawing the sorts, of which the principal instance in this case, his late sacred majesty, the blessed martyr, King Charles and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me, yet as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched, I set down the results. In this case I found that they pointed true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I made then 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in first these words from Luke 13:7, cut it down, and the second Isaiah 13:20, it shall never be inhabited, and upon the third experiment, Job 39:30, her young ones also suck up blood. That is all need to be quoted from Mr. Crom's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crom on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger and the Malicious Dealings of the Antichrist. It being the vicar's view, as well as the most commonly held in the neighborhood, the squire was the victim of recrudescence of the popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded the title and estates, and so ends the first act of Canceringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the same room in which his father had died, nor indeed was it slept in by anyone other than the occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735. I do not find anything particularly marked in his reign, save a curious constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who were interested in the dealings will find a statistical account in the letter of the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night and keeping no sheep in his park, where he had noticed nothing was ever attacked that spent nights indoors, and after that disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chance, as we now have no good account of the symptoms, and as all night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that his great family pew was built on the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideals that the several graves in that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Cromwell. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed. And the feeling of surprise, indeed disquiet, was very strong when it was found that, though her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatsoever inside it of a body, bones, or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying, no such things were dreamt of as resurrect men. It is difficult to conceive of any rational notion for stealing a body other than for the use of dissecting room. The innocent revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and the exploits of witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought of by a good many to be rather foolhardy, although they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. For his time the hall had been a fine block of mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard traveled to Italy and became infected with Italian taste. And having more money than his predecessors, he was determined to leave an Italian place where he had bought an English house. So Stucker and Asher massed the bricks. Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted around in the entrance hall and gardens, and a reproduction of Sybil's temple of Trivoli was erected in the opposite bank of the Mere. Castringham took on an entirely new, and if I must say, entirely less engaging aspect. But it was much admired and served as a model for a good many of the neighboring gentry in after years. One morning, it was 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney had smoked persistently, and yet it was so cold he must keep up a fire. Also, something had so rattled about the window so that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of distemper, which continued among his game, had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. What really touched him most was nearly the other matter of a sleepless night. He certainly could not sleep in that room again. It was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast. After it, he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. Though this had a window with an eastern aspect, and that with a northern, this room, which servants would be always passing, that he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun would not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of business the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know there is but one room like that in the house." "Which may be," said Sir Richard. "That is Sir Matthew's, the western chamber." "Well, put me in there. I'll lie there tonight," said the master. "Which way is it?" "Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, no one has slept there for these 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died in there." Thus she spoke and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and indeed the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and impatiently as was his wont, threw the shutters back, and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, and grown up it was as if the great ash tree grown up as it was with the great ash tree and being otherwise concealed from view. Alright, Mrs. Chiddock. All today and move my furniture in this afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room. Pray, Sir Richard, said a new voice breaking in on the speech. Might I have a favor of a moment's interview? Sir Richard turned and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will perhaps hardly remember me. My name is William Crom, and my grandfather was vicar in your father's time. Well, sir, said Sir Richard, the name of Crom is always a passport to Castringham. I'm glad to renew the friendship of 2 generations standing. What can I serve you? For your hour of calling, and if I do not mistake you, your bearing, it shows you to be in some haste. That is more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds with what haste I can make, and I have called on my way to leave you some papers which we have but just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left at his death. I thought you might find some matters of family interest in them. You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crom, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlor and drink a glass of wine, we will first look at these same papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, be about airing this chamber. Yes, it is here that my grandfather died, and yes, the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish, but I do not wish to listen any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir? They went to the study, the package which Mr. Crom had brought. He was just then become a fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I must say, and the subsequently brought out respectable edition of Paulinus? Contained, among other things, the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical sortes biblica which you have heard. They amused him a great deal. Well, he said, my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, ye may rest assured I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of cartars and agues was never seen. The parlor contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard took the paper from the bookcase. I wonder, says he, whether the old prophet is in there yet. I fancy I see him. Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which, sure enough, bore the fly-leaf inscription to Matthew Fell from his loving godmother, Anne Aldous, 5 September, 1659. It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crom. I will wager we get a couple of names in the Chronicle. What do we have here? Thou shalt thank me in the morning. I shall not be. And I shall not be. Well, well, your grandfather would make a fine omen of that. No more profits for me. They are all a tale. And now, Mr. Crom, I am infinitely obliged to you for your package. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray allow me another glass. And so, with offers of hospitality, which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's dress and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Henry, Sir William Kenterfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning, Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun up with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two men were walking along the terrace, taking alterations and improvements of the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, "You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why, my lord, that is in fact my own. Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it said that it brings the worst luck of a year to sleep near an ash tree. You have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps," the bishop went on with a smile, "it has given you a touch of quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say, so much fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you. That or something else is true. It cost me sleep from 12 to 4, my lord. But the tree is to come down tomorrow, and I shall not hear much more from it. I applaud your determination. I could hardly be wholesome to have air you breathe strained, as it were, through that leafage. Your lordship is right there, I think, but I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping on the grass that kept me open-eyed. I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. You can see here from this point. None of those nearest branches can even touch the casement unless there were a gale. There was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot. Not true, then. What? Not true, sir. What then will it be? I wonder that scratched and rustled so. Aye, and covered the dusk on my sill with lines and marks. At last they agreed rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to the rooms and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we are in his bedroom, with the light out and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside still and warm, so the window stands open. And there is very little light about the bedside, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which moved back and forth, even low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There. Something drops off the bed with a soft plump, like a kitten. It is out the window in a flash. Another, 4. And after that it is again quiet. Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. As with Sir Matthew, so was Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, Popist emissaries, of infected air, all these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, and in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tomcat was crouching, looking down upon the hollow which years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit on the edge of it stood. Then a bit on the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, a yell as such came out of the trunk of the great tree. 2 or 3 screams there were, witnesses were not sure, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. The Lady Mary Henry fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled until she fell upon the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Kentefield stayed, yet even they were daunted, though it was only the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up. Looking down in the hollow, he could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern and let it down by rope. "We must get at the bottom of this, my life on it, my lord. But the secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern, and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with incredulous terror and loathing before he cried out in a dreadful voice, and fell back from the ladder, where, happily, he was caught by 2 men, letting the lantern fall into the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be gotten from him. By then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken to the bottom, and the light in it caught upon the dry leaves and rubbish that lay there for a few minutes. A dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and, to be short, the tree was ablaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for clearly whatever might be using the tree for its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First at the fork they saw a round body covered with fire. The size of a man's head very suddenly appeared, then seemed to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times, then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where after a moment it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, veined and seared. And as the the fire burned lower, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk. It was seen that these were all covered with grayish hair. All that day the ash tree burned, until it fell to pieces and men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in to examine the roots of the tree. They found, said the Bishop Kilmore, below it, in a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein there were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures had plainly been smoldered by the smoke, and what is to be more curious, at the sight of this den against the wall, was crouching the anatomy of a skeleton of a human being, with skin dried upon the bone, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those who examined it undoubtedly to be the body of a woman, clearly dead for a period of 50 years. And that is The Ash Tree by M.R. James. And I think that might very well be the last story I read tonight. It is getting a little bit late. And I don't want to keep people up too much longer with spooky stories, but let's see who we can possibly raid here. I don't see anybody on the main channel. Let me check the other Twitch. See anyone there? Let's see if there's a nice ASMR channel we can raid. Yes, I forgot how colorful this category can be at certain times of day. Here's somebody. We've got 4 viewers and they're doing a ASMR roleplay reading for people. Let's see. This person. Oh. This is an interesting person. They are also playing Xenogears. Not tonight, but they are playing Xenogears. Sure. Let's send a raid over this way. They are playing Starfield tonight. This is Meteorite. I'm going to send the raid their way. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I hope you had fun. Oh, missed the gas leak. Streaming schedule is out for next week already. So Next stream will be Tuesday night. We're going to be starting up a new game called Rack and Ruin, which I first encountered on Kickstarter ages and ages and ages ago. You're very welcome. Thank you for stopping by. We're going to be playing Rack and Ruin Tuesday night, and Wednesday we're going to be starting Evil Dead. No, not Evil Dead. Evil West. Keep getting that name wrong. But that is steampunk vampires in the Old West. Should be a lot of fun. Anyway, let me hit this button for the raid, and then I will send you off to some place that will hopefully be nice and cozy for us. Y'all take care and have a good rest of your night, or morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever it is in your part of the world. And happy spooky season. Sleep well, everyone.